Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Mother Nature's Rule Breakers Part 3, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Mike Hillman. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Mike. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thanks, Kendall. Well, again, welcome everyone to my presentation. We're going to have hopefully a fun 45 minutes or so geeking out about some weird things when it comes to nature. But I want to start things off by introducing myself. So I've been a guide with Natural Habitat Adventures for a few years now. I guide in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks in the Rockies. I guide up in Churchill for polar bear season. Over in Alaska, I guide through Denali, Katmai, and Kenai Fjords National Parks, and I guide in Greenland as well. And I'll actually, this year, coming up with our new trips, I'll be guiding down in Florida in the spring. So maybe I'll see some of you guys out there. I am originally from Michigan, but I'm calling to you from my home in Arizona. And I got my degree in zoology from Michigan State University. And ever since, even before I was in college, I was very interested in weird and unusual animals because with my mind, how I like to set things up with there's specific rules for specific animals and boxes that we put specific animals in and species. And I like all those different boxes, but I also kind of like the idea of that some of these animals don't quite subscribe to that and are fit a little bit outside of things. And so I've always had this interest with weird and unusual animals. And I started after my college degree working in the zoo and aquarium industry in a number of zoos around the country, and was starting to see and actually meet some of these species in person and get to love them even more, all these weird and peculiar facts. I mean, some of the more common animals we think of have some weird facts about them. And then as I became a guide, I realized how useful this information was because those are the kinds of things that our guests like to learn about on trips, or these weird and unusual animals that break the mold and really go against what we consider usual or normal animal behavior. And so with these presentations, I've been able to do now 3, this will be the 3rd one, our first 2 presentations of Mother Nature's Rule Breakers. You can find online if you're curious. We have a YouTube page for Natural Habitat Adventures. You can search us and go to the Daily Dose of Nature playlist and see all the webinars there. Or you can also make it easy on yourself and go to our website, nathab.com, and find all of our webinars posted there as well. And you can take a look at my other 2 webinars if you're curious, if you enjoy this one a lot. I highly recommend it. First one, I geek out all about platypus and weird creatures like that. And then I talk about in my second one, herbivores that sometimes cheat on their diet. So there's a whole host of interesting information. If you find this one pretty rewarding, do check those out. So the way this presentation is going to work is I'm going to present to you a rule. I'll do 7 rules today that you probably learned in school, maybe grade school or even college, that help you to kind of categorize a group of animals. And I'm going to show you some of those rule breakers, those exceptions to the rule, and talk a little bit about why they're so interesting and why they break the rules that they do. So we're going to start things off with rule number 1. Mammals don't have scales. Pretty easy one we learned pretty early on in our elementary days. When we think about scaled animals, we think about something like our snake here, our cobra, lizards, other reptiles have scales. Of course, fish have scales as well, like this tarpon that we can find down in Florida. And actually, if you look at birds closely enough, like this ostrich, if we zoom in, you'll see that on their legs they have scales as well. So these are animals that all have scales. When we think of mammals, we think about this guy. This is a picture I got in Katmai National Park, this cute little grizzly cub. And then you think of a mammal with this nice, warm, soft fur that covers their whole body. That's one of the characteristics of a mammal, right? Well, the next animal that's our first rule breaker is going to be an animal that's part pinecone, part T-Rex, and part anteater. I don't know if anyone's been maybe have a guess as to what this is yet. This is what's called the pangolin. You've probably not heard of this animal before, but you can see it's covered in these hard scales. Looks a bit like a pine cone, doesn't it? Standing on 2 legs, walking with its 2 shorter arms up in front, a bit like a T-Rex, and it's got that long snout like an anteater. This is actually 4 different species that we find in the world, in parts of Africa, in Southern Asia, India, those sorts of places where you can find pangolins. And this species, like I said, is covered in all these hard scales. Now, those scales are made of keratin, which is the same stuff that makes up our hair, makes up our fingernails as well. So you can think of it almost covered in a bunch of fingernails all across its body. And some of the species of pangolin can have upwards of 1,000 scales covering their whole body. Here's an example of what this scale looks like. And so for some of the larger species of pangolin, they can actually be quite big and quite tough. And what that allows them to do, as you might suspect, is allows them to curl up into a ball, and then that protects themselves. So this individual right here in this video that I'm playing probably actually isn't curling up for predators. This one I think is mud bathing, but you kind of get the idea. The same motion would take place for that pangolin to then curl up into a ball. And that makes this ball pretty impenetrable. You can see it's like a little fortress right there, almost like an armadillo. And so out in places like Africa, we have animals like this younger lion that finds a pangolin, it curls up, and now it's trying to get inside of that pangolin, but not having good luck with it at all. Even with biting with its teeth, it's not actually going through those tough outer scales. So it's a pretty good defense. Now, pangolins, when they're not being attacked by lions or other animals, will move through the landscape. They're a bit like an anteater. And then they'll crawl around in the dirt looking for mounds of ants and termites. And they can eat upwards of about 200,000 termites or ants in a single day. So they're pretty voracious appetite, these little guys. And they're able to do this with these big, strong front claws that dig through the dirt. And they also have a really long tongue. So take a look at this tongue that he's sticking out right there. It can be 16 inches long. And by coating that with a very sticky saliva, there goes that tongue. You can stick it all out the way and then lap up those termites as their nest is disturbed. Now, this video on the right here, the white one, I also want to point out, take a look at this angle too. You see that tail looks a bit serrated, almost like a saw. And these scales can be quite sharp on the edges. And so even in the case of that lion that's trying to open up that pangolin that's all the way curled up, that tail wrapped around it, tries to stick his paw in there to try to peel it open a little bit to get at that soft underbelly. What he's going to do is get that tail right up against his arm, and that pangolin will then start thrashing around, knows full well that those scales are quite sharp, and almost like a serrated saw, moving that tail back and forth against the paw can actually injure the lions. They have to be very careful if they're going to even try to go after a pangolin. So these are pretty well defensed animals and very unusual to say the least. So that was rule number 1. Mammals do in fact have scales. The only one that does is our pangolin. Now let's go to rule number 2. This one you probably learned even before elementary school. Just growing up, looking in your kitchen, seeing your chicken eggs, you might be thinking all eggs are round. And certainly when we talk about birds, we talk about round eggs. Some can be perfectly spherical, some can be a little bit cone shaped, but they're all have got this general round shape to them, but of course come in a lot of different colors. And the roundness is important for birds and a lot of other animals because those round eggs can be stacked together, like you see right here. They can fit together quite nicely. So a mother hen, in the case of the chicken, can sit on those eggs, keep them nice and warm. In addition, just for the pure mechanics of it, a round egg is easier to lay for that mother hen. And so that's why eggs generally have that round shape. And it's not just for birds too. When we look at something like this is actually ladybugs. These are the young and their eggs. And so those are that kind of round shape, a bit more elongated, but still round. And then we have snake eggs, also elongated, but still round. And even frog eggs, amphibians too, will have a round egg. They don't have that hard outer shell like on the other eggs. There's kind of a gelatinous mass around their young, but there's still a nice, beautiful round sphere to them. So when we think of eggs, that's why we think of them round, because a lot of them do. But of course, we're talking about rule breakers today. And if we go down into the water, we start seeing some weird shapes. These are some pretty interesting and peculiar eggs. You can actually see, if you look inside, you'll see the yolk, which is that dark round shape. And the elongated shape right there is actually a fish. And these are an egg from a shark. In fact, about 30% of sharks lay eggs. The other 70% actually do live birth. And sharks, as well as their cousins, the rays, some of them, as well as their cousins, the skates, which are a close cousin of the rays, all of them lay eggs. And they come in a variety of different shapes. So something like a skate egg, like we see right here, it's a typical one if you live on the coast in, say, the Atlantic coast in the US, or some cases the Pacific coast or other parts of the world near the coast, you might occasionally see these washing ashore. They're kind of leathery in shape. They're actually made out of a collagen-like protein, and they feel a bit leathery in shape, and they typically have these horns or spikes coming off them that you see right there. It almost looks like an egg version of a ravioli, if you catch my drift there. And you can even actually look inside, like we saw in the early picture, and see that little guy wiggling around just by sticking a light through there. It's called candling there. And so they'll persist in that egg for quite a while. One of my personal favorite eggs when we talk about weird eggs is from the Port Jackson shark. This is a shark that's found in places like Australia. And from this museum specimen, this is a Port Jackson shark. You can see the young, and then you can see the egg that it came out of. It's kind of round if you kind of squint and look at the general shape, but it's got all these major flaps and flanges around it. They're in this kind of spirally screw pattern. And that's important. That's there for a reason. Because when our Port Jackson shark lays this egg, she'll then pick it up and then swim around with it and find a rocky crevice or down into the substrate somewhere. She wants to settle this in place and make sure it's not gonna move. And she'll literally spin around with her body, screwing that egg with that round spirally shape, screwing it into the rocky crevice, so it's incredibly hard to pull out, much more secure. So animals, predators that might want to go after this egg have a really tough time trying to pull it out and eat it. And depending on the species of ray or skate or shark that lay eggs, this process can last quite a while, anywhere between 4 and 10 months from when the point the mother lays the egg before that youngster actually hatches out. So that's why it's incredibly important to make this egg so it can secure to the substrate below, so it doesn't get washed away, end up in the wrong place, get too cold, too warm, or get attacked by predators. A close cousin of the Port Jackson shark is a crested horn shark. You can see their egg shape is somewhat similar, right? It's got that round-ish shape, but it's got all those flaps around it. But then notice all looks like horsehair or spaghetti coming off the bottom of that. And those long strands serve a second purpose in attaching itself. We take a look at this picture from a beach in Australia. If we zoom on down, we'll see that actually those strands attach to some seaweed. And so just another extra anchor to hold that egg in place while it develops over several months. And just to go through some of my other favorites, this is an Australian swell shark. Has not the flaps, but it has all these ridges. You can see how shoving that into a little crevice in a rock would hold it in place quite well. Here's a zebra shark. Their eggs look a little bit like a leaf, like a banana leaf, and it's got some fuzzy bits along the outsides that help it attach to things. Oh, here's a weird one. This is the Australian ghost shark. This one looks like something out of an alien movie, right? So this one with those weird flaps helps like sand and stuff settle on top of it so it holds it in place. And here's a really big one. Take a look at the size of this guy. This is from a big skate. So again, a cousin to the rays, and just a massive, massive egg that can wash ashore from time to time. So keep an eye out for that. All right, moving on. Nature's rule number 3. A species can't successfully breed with another species. Makes sense, right? Goes without saying. When you get 2 emperor penguins together, they mate, they have a little young. That is another emperor penguin. And then to a different species, a Gen 2 penguin, they mate, they have a Gen 2 penguin, right? Well, we know that some species can mate with each other, right? You get a horse and a donkey together, sometimes they mate and you get yourself a mule. But you might know that if you take that mule and then try to breed it with another mule or a donkey or a horse, nothing happens because their offspring are infertile. That's the end of that line. That hybrid can't have its own offspring. And this is what's called the biological species concept. So this is the definition you probably learned in school when it comes to what a species is. It's a group of organisms that can breed with one another and produce fertile offspring, and that continues the line generation after generation, and that's how we define what a species is. But when we look at how taxonomy works, this exactly goes along with that biological species concept. Of course, this is probably something you saw in your high school textbook. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. As we zoom in, we get narrower and narrower, and more of those animals in each of those categories get closer together until you finally end up with a species. In this case, a black bear breeds with other black bears. But if you move out into the genus, wouldn't necessarily be able to breed with a polar bear or a brown bear or anything else as we move further along. But we have been seeing a lot of interesting information that kind of goes against that, because if you've been ever on a Churchill or polar bear trip with us in the last 5 or so years, you've probably heard about this study where they've seen hybridization between polar bears and grizzly bears. Now, according to the biological species concept, maybe they can hybridize, but certainly they can't create fertile offspring. And this study looked at a number of hybrids that were found in northern Canada and started testing the genetics of those hybrids, what they call a pizzly bear or a growler bear, depending on your terminology. And what they found was that there's one particular female, she's kind of famous in the polar bear world, her name is 10960, and several different mating bouts and offspring, she mated with a grizzly bear. And she gave birth to some sets of growler bears, the hybrids. And you can see some of the kind of faint characteristics that kind of match up between the two. It's got more of a grizzly face with those dark eyes and muzzle. Sometimes they'll have brownish fur along their feet. Now, what's really surprising is then one of her offspring, one of 1096 offsprings, one of her daughters, ended up mating with a grizzly bear and produced a second generation hybrid. So her offspring were not infertile. They were perfectly fine breeding again and continuing that line of genetics. And actually, we see this in a number of different species. When we talk about birds, this happens quite a bit. This is a mallard, of course, you're probably familiar with on the left. And this is a female northern pintail on the right. And sometimes we see this, which is the hybrid of those two species. To give you an idea of what the male looks like, you can see those combination of characteristics in what is a very beautiful hybrid duck, right? And we've even seen it with swans mating with geese, creating one of my favorite words, a swoose. And we see it gets even more complex and unusual when we start looking at some other species like reptiles and amphibians. Take, for instance, these. This is the Ensatina salamanders. They're found in California. And each of these different salamanders you see on the picture here are subspecies, right? So they're not quite different enough from each other to be their own species. And typically when you think about subspecies, oftentimes we think they can breed together, right? And each one of these salamanders is somewhat unique to a region or a part of California around the Sierras. And at each of the points where those populations of subspecies meet, they're able to breed. That's kind of signifying with those red arrows. But when we start with the kind of reddish one down at the bottom, work our way all the way around to the other side to the black and yellow one, each one of those different salamanders can breed with the one prior to it. But then we get those two at the bottom, they can't breed with each other. This is what's called a ring species. And this happens occasionally where there's enough change along the chain of all these subspecies that by the time they meet again on the other side of a mountain range, in this case, they're not able to breed together. Now, this is a really interesting example as well in reptiles. We have two different species of whiptail lizard that we can find here in the American Southwest, and they breed together fairly readily, and they create a third species called the New Mexico whiptail. Now, the reason that we don't call this just a hybrid like a mule or a growler bear is because that New Mexico whiptail, very much like the Komodo dragons from my last rule breakers presentation, they actually can give birth on their own without mating again with another lizard. And so they're able to give rise to their own lineage of New Mexico whiptail lizards. So if you're interested in what that's called, it's called parthenogenesis. And check out my last rule breakers when I talk a lot more in depth about how that operates. But this species is created specifically from a hybridization of two other species. And so when we think about the biological species concept, there obviously are a number of ways that this can be broken, and some really simple ones I've even talked about. Think of bacteria, right? So microorganisms, they don't necessarily breed sexually, they breed asexually. They just split apart and create new organisms off of their own line. So they don't have to breed together and produce fertile offspring. They're doing it through asexual reproduction. Then also think about things like fossils, right? When we think about a T-Rex, a Tyrannosaurus Rex, we are never going to see, at least I'm not going to, and I hazard a guess many of you won't see a T-Rex breed with another T-Rex to know that it's a species. So how are they determining this? In fact, when I was a younger kid, that was one of the things I was very confused about with the fossils, is if we can find a fossil on every step of the evolutionary chart from one animal to the next, where do we draw that line of like, okay, now it's a new species? And so that's where the biological species concept kind of breaks down. So the question is, what exactly is a species? And the short answer is we don't know for sure. In fact, take birds, for example. So when we say in the entire world, the species of birds that we have discovered in the scientific community, we can put them in a checklist of birds. We know all the species in the world that we know to date. And one of those is called the Clemens checklist. This is used by a lot of ornithologists, researchers, scientists, and enthusiasts in North America, put out in part by the American Birding Association and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And that checklist comes up with 10,721 species of birds in the world. Now, if we go across the pond to Europe, they have the International Ornithologists Union, and they actually come up with 10,758. And a lot of European scientists and scientists in different parts of the world use that number rather than the Clemens number. So the scientific community isn't even in full agreement as how many bird species we know about to date. Some cases, the subspecies are true species when we look at the International Union versus they're just subspecies when we look at Clemens checklist, or vice versa. And in fact, this problem is pretty rampant. We actually have over 24 different definitions of what a species is, all these different species concepts. And each of them try to solve one of these problems with one of the other previous concepts. And this is what's known as the species problem. And so some of these concepts look at the DNA, right? We've got these major advances in genetics. We can just look at the DNA to determine whether this is a species or not. And while it can be useful in some cases, where we draw the line about how much difference in DNA, in genetics, from one species to the next is an arbitrary number that we will just decide on as a scientific community. Some look at the morphological characteristics. Those are the characteristics of the bone, of the body, of the fur, the feathers, what have you, that we can see generally with our naked eye. Those differences can determine one species from the next. We can look at the fossil record and another species concept where we look at those differences in the fossil record, and when we see a major change between one fossil and the next, that's where we draw the line when one species starts and the other one ends. Or we can actually even look at the ecology. So think about a species in an environment that does a certain task. Or in case of our grizzly bears and our polar bears, for example, a grizzly bear can live in the forest, live in these open environments, eats a lot of different stuff than a polar bear that lives out on the sea ice, eating primarily seals, and they're very different in how they operate in the habitat. So they are clearly different species in that ecological species concept. And what we find is that it's quite difficult to put every single organism into one box. In fact, that's kind of the reason I did these presentations, these 3 different Mother Nature's rule breakers, is I want to show all these animals that don't quite fit the rule, don't quite fit the scheme. And so when scientists look to identify a new species or present a new species or talk about splitting what we thought was one species into 2 species or vice versa, they have to use a lot of these different concepts and say, okay, with this concept and this concept and this concept, maybe all that consensus together means these should be different species, or we have in fact found a new species. And what that just goes to show is that we've got all these weird rules that sometimes get broken. And I think Darwin said it best when he said, it all comes, I believe, from trying to define the indefinable, where we kind of know a species when we see it, but there's a lot of these gray areas. And that's where science is both a little bit frustrating, but also kind of cool, because it's incredibly complex and it doesn't immediately fit the rules that we put on it. There always can be these surprises that we find from time to time, which I think is kind of interesting. And certainly, as we talk about the species problem, that's not something that's going to be solved anytime soon, but certainly the debate and all the research that's going into it and understanding how species operate is super important to science as we talk about what species we're talking about, how to research them, and of course, even talking about conservation as well and what species to take care of and where we should put our resources. So that was a bit of a big topic. I'm gonna bring it back a little bit and go with rule number 4, pretty fun one. Only tongues can taste. Well, we know as a mammal, as vertebrate, we have this tongue. It has all these taste buds on it. And if we zoom in to understand how taste buds work, as food or drink, or the chemical composition of our food or drink passes over our individual taste buds, little sensors sense those chemicals as they're washing over, and those sensors, those sensory cells, then send a signal to our brain to tell us if that food is sour, or if it's sweet or bitter or anything else savory. And so that's how the taste buds work in our tongue. But outside of the vertebrates, we start getting interesting things, or outside of mammals, I should say, we start getting some interesting places where we find taste buds. Insects actually have taste buds in a lot of different places. This fly has taste buds on its feet. So as it lands on you or lands on your food at a picnic, it's tasting the food before it even sticks its mouth down to try to eat it. And it's actually a really important thing for butterflies, like this monarch butterfly. They also have taste buds in their feet. And so as this butterfly is flying from flower to flower, pollinating, drinking up nectar along the way, it's also, if it's a female, tasting the flower because it's trying to find the right host plant for its eggs. And as it flies from plant to plant, and as gardeners may know, our monarchs really like milkweed plants. And if it finds a milkweed that's in good condition because it tastes good from their feet, they'll then lay their eggs on that milkweed. And that allows, gives their caterpillar, their young caterpillars a head start because they're on a very good, nutritious host plant, as they grow up and eventually turn into a chrysalis and then emerge out as a butterfly and continue that process all over again. Now, the insects are interesting, but I have to say the catfish probably takes the cake. They have an incredible amount of taste buds. They're actually known in the fishing world as a swimming tongue. And that's because they actually have taste buds not only in their mouth, not only in the barbels, the whiskers along the side of their face, but they have taste buds over their entire body. So what that means is that a person will have somewhere around 10,000 taste buds. A catfish can have upwards of 175,000 taste buds. So a massive amount. And these taste buds, when you look at a microscope version of this, you look at their skin, each one of these raised bumps looks a bit like a pimple. Each one of those is a taste bud that covers their whole skin. Now, those whiskers are still critically important, those barbels as they're called. And so a lot of the taste buds are concentrated along those barbels. And this is because of the environment that we find a catfish in. They swim through murky waters in rivers, lakes, ponds, those sorts of things. And they're trying to find food that can be frogs, fish, crayfish, even birds are on the menu for some catfish. And by tasting the water with not only their barbels, but their whole body, they can sense out their prey without having to use their sense of sight to look for it. They can hone in on it by tasting the water as they swim through. So for my fishermen in the audience, next time you catch and eat a catfish, remember that it actually tasted you long before you tasted it as you pick it up. All right, nature's rule number 5. So this one's going to be a little bit of a creepy one, but I promise you it's not as bad as it sounds. Snakes slither on the ground. Makes sense, right? We're used to seeing snakes on the ground. In fact, we've sometimes seen in nature documentaries, or you may have seen in your own person, snakes slithering across the ground and using their coils to push themselves along through the dirt, able to move quite well, and in some cases quite quickly without the use of limbs, just by maneuvering their body. Now, this is a pretty interesting one. This is one of my favorite snakes of all time. This is called the banded sea krait. And the banded sea krait is a species of sea snake that's found in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, in places in Southern Asia, near Australia, Papua New Guinea, that sort of thing. And this species is kind of near and dear to my heart, particularly because I think the first time I did a report on an animal, keep in mind, this was back in elementary school, and our teacher asked us to report on an animal. And so in elementary school, kids are picking like lion and zebra and giraffe and bear and wolf. And then I come up with my report of a banded sea krait. I had to explain to my teacher what this was. And a banded sea krait is essentially a sea snake that lives out in the coral reefs in these oceans. And they swim incredibly well. Take a look at this video footage of this guy just moving along through the water. And they'll move through the coral reefs. They're a predator, as you would expect, and they're going after things like small fish. And in particular, their favorite are eels. So it's one long noodle eating another long noodle, which is kind of cool. And they can stay underwater for quite a while. We're talking somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes per dive as they swim down through these coral reefs. Now, they aren't exclusively in the water. You can occasionally find them on land. They have to, of course, come to land to lay their eggs and hatch out. They'll come to land to rest from time to time as well. And so you can find them on some of these islands, but then find them in the coral reef swimming around looking for food. And the reason they're able to swim so well is because they have modifications to their body. Now, of course, you can imagine a little noodle swimming along pretty well, but they also, you look at that, this is the tail. It's actually flattened, a bit like a paddle on the end. So as they move their whole body, that paddle propels them along, and they move quite quickly through the water as they're catching food. So really cool species. Now, something that I kind of alluded to in the description of this talk is that sometimes snakes take to the air. I kid you not. So take a look at this. This is the paradise tree snake. This is another species of snake found in Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, and they live in these rainforest environments. And they are arboreal, meaning they're climbing up in the trees. And as they climb up into the trees, they're looking for small animals, things like lizards and frogs and small birds, insects, those sorts of things. And when they climb through a tree, they're looking for food, and say they see a tree just across the way that would be lovely to go to and try hunting there after they've done all their hunting in this one tree. Now, ordinarily what they would have to do is, unless those branches are touching up in the rainforest canopy, they literally have to climb all the way down the branch, down to the trunk, all the way down to the bottom of the rainforest floor, cross the rainforest floor, and then repeat the process climbing all the way up the next tree. Incredibly energy intensive and pretty risky. Even though they're a snake, they do have their own predators like big birds of prey, like hawks and eagles. And so they'll risk a lot if they try to climb down and move on to the next tree. It'd be great if they could just jump from one tree to the next. And that's kind of literally what they do. This is a series of slides here showing the takeoff. And you can see the snake, what it'll do when it wants to move from one tree to the next. It'll climb out onto the edge of its branch as far as it possibly can go without falling off the branch, still holding on with just a little bit of that tail. And then it'll form its body in this nice little J loop shape here. And then with a burst of energy, it'll yank itself up, launching its head up into the air. And then at the same time, it flattens its body out because its ribs are literally, its rib cage is literally opening up, spreading the skin and flattening the body out as it does this. So here's a video showing this in one fluid motion. Check that out, just launching itself out there. And so, and it's not just a jump. So scientists wanted to study this. So, and at Virginia Tech, they actually took some of these paradise tree snakes and put them in a completely black room with motion capture dots and the whole 9 yards like they do in the movies to track this movement as they fly. And what they found is as they flatten their body, you can see that in the pictures right there, and then the figure C right there, the gray one, shows that body in cross section as it flattens. If you look at it, it looks a bit like a frisbee, doesn't it? And in fact, that looks a lot like a frisbee in cross section. And in the same way that a frisbee flies is how the snake is flying. Because as that curved shape, where it's curved on the top and kind of flat or concave underneath, what this does in physics is it creates a low air pressure on the top of the surface, and it creates a high air pressure on the bottom of the surface. And that causes both the frisbee and the snake to have lift, to actually rise a little bit in the air as it flies. And so when we see the snake jumping out, check this out, you'll see another video of this, launching itself off that stick, and you see it's actually slithering in the air. Do you guys notice that? Slithering along, and that almost like a frisbee, if you just try to take a frisbee and just toss it straight, it wouldn't do much, right? You have to have that spin on it that provides stabilization. And in much the same way, our snake, as it slithers through the air, as it's launching itself out, it provides that stabilization and even a bit of direction, so it can choose a little bit which way to go and how far to go before it gets to the next branch, or in even some cases, it can go from the tree all the way down to the ground. And these flights can be really short, just a few feet, or the record that I found online was 330 feet for one of these tree snake flights. Look how it just cruises along in this video here. Now, before you guys start freaking out and worrying about snakes jumping out of trees, these are, again, snakes that we find in Southeast Asia, and their venom is quite mild. It's only used on the prey that they're going for, and they're relatively docile. This is actually research footage, and they're literally picking up the snake, taking it up, and then putting it on the branch and sending it along. So no worries about wearing a helmet outside, worrying about rattlesnakes or something jumping out of the sky. That's not going to happen anytime soon. All right, rule number 6. You have to open your eyes to see with them. Goes without saying, right? We have eyelids. We open them up to take a look out, and those eyelids do offer a bit of protection. Of course, the eyelashes and the eyelid itself protect against wind and dirt and those sorts of things, any damage if we're running into some bushes and leaves. So pretty useful characteristic to have, but of course not all animals have them. Think about fish don't really have eyelids, or snakes don't have eyelids in the true sense. But this is a really remarkable example of how they get around not having traditional eyelids. This is called a barreleye fish. This is from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. This is just about the only footage we have of this species. So it's still fairly unstudied in its natural environment at the very least. And let's freeze this picture for a second here. Take a look. So this head is literally clear. That's what you're seeing, is you're seeing through its head to the inside of its head. And let's start labeling some of the features. The obvious one is the mouth, right? That's the mouth right down there at the bottom. Then what you see are those two little black circles above the mouth aren't the eyes, they're actually the nostrils, which means these big green orbs that you can see through the head of this fish are its eyes, which is pretty strange. Now, we don't know exactly why this has happened, but scientists have some different theories. And one of these theories has to do with this guy right here. This is another species that's found in another animal organism, I should say, that's found in these deep water environments where you find the barreleye. And this is what's called a siphonophore. You can kind of think of it in a very simplistic terms, almost like a bunch of jellyfish all joined together, creating this long net of tentacles that can be over 100 feet long, and they catch drifting organisms going by, like this jellyfish here. Now, for a barreleye, having those clear eyes, looking straight at them, they may see things like the siphonophore catching our jellyfish, but this siphonophore is catching them with these tentacles with all these stinging cells all along it, because of course they're somewhat related to jellyfish with those stinging cells to be able to catch food and paralyze it immediately before digesting it. So take this siphonophore. If we go down below it in the water column, maybe as deep as 2,500 feet, we can find our barreleye fish there looking straight up with those big green orbs. You can zoom in, and those orbs, those eyes aren't perfectly round like ours. They're actually more tubular, more column shaped or oval shaped like this. And so they look straight up in the air, and by being compressed like that, would ordinarily be a very distant view of something above it. They have essentially binocular vision, which allows them to zoom in and see the siphonophore above it and the prey that it just captured. And so what scientists theorize, the reason why these eyes are inside the head rather than outside the head, is because this siphonophore, or this Barreleye, when it sees that prey, it wants to steal it from the siphonophore and eat it for himself. So they'll tilt their body up, start swimming towards the surface, but notice the eyes now aren't looking up, they're looking backwards. Not super helpful. And up until recently, we thought those eyes were fixed in place because they're so large, but we've actually been able to see, scientists have been able to see that they rotate inside their head so they can look straight forward through the clear front, almost like a windshield, and they'll swim up towards the surface and then grab this jellyfish off the siphonophore and get their meal that way. So literally that shield protects the eyes from all those stinging tentacles by having those eyes buried, embedded in the head with their top of their head completely clear dome that they can then look through to find their food, which is really weird adaptation. And when we go down deep below into the ocean environment, we can definitely say that evolution has gone pretty weird with it when it comes to some of these species. And hopefully over the years, as we do more of these remote operated vehicle expeditions, we'll be able to study these barreleyes a little bit more and know a little bit more about what's going on with these eyes as they're swimming along. Pretty strange creature. All right, our seventh and final rule, only males have antlers. So this is something I touched on actually in my first Rule Breakers presentation. When we talk about the deer family, things like our elk, moose, our white-tailed deer, our caribou, all the males have the antlers. And we look at the females, they don't. But take a look. Our reindeer, our caribou, actually has antlers. The female does. Then as an aside, I kind of used both terms there. Reindeer and caribou are the same animal. In the US or in the North America, we talk about caribou as the wild version of the deer and reindeer as the domesticated version. In parts of Europe, like Norway, typically they use the word reindeer, but it's the same species. And kind of as another side, something I really want to get across, something that when I first learned about it really blew my mind, was reindeer aren't just part of the Arctic North. This is the range of reindeer, and in the historic range is that kind of lighter brown that we see towards the bottom. And take a look at the bottom right here. We had reindeer, we had caribou in the United States, the lower 48, not just up in Alaska. We had them in Washington and in Idaho and Montana. And actually as recently as 2019, we had caribou in Idaho. And so this is actually the last individual of our herd that would historically migrate from Canada and British Columbia down into the United States and then back. But this herd actually had shrunk in size till we had just basically one female left. They caught her up, and hopefully you're going to be able to start a captive breeding program with organizations in British Columbia that hopefully we can rebuild this population that was the southern, what we call the Selkirk population of caribou that migrated down into the United States. But I'd always thought about caribou as this Arctic animal in places like northern Canada, northern Alaska, in Siberia, but never in Washington and Idaho, but we actually had them in the mountains out there. All right, so that's my aside, something I want to just get across because it's really weird. But when we talk about caribou, both the males and females have antlers. And if you look at this picture, you might be able to identify the males from the females. The male one on the right there has a really nice, good-looking set of antlers, a bit sturdier, a bit more points to them than the females we see on the left that are part of his harem. And we know why males have antlers, right? The males will fight for dominance. They fight for access to females to get that harem of females they can breed with during the season. And even just the rack itself is impressive with all the points and the size of it. So that's impressive to the ladies. And without another male around, he can still attract the ladies just by showing off that rack, right? Well, it's important when we talk about understanding why the females break this mold, because of the various 40 other species of deer that we have in the world, only the caribou, both the males and females, have antlers. The important way to figure this out is by actually looking at the time that these antlers fall off. So in this picture, we actually both have males. Both individuals are males. The one on the left that's walking away had just recently dropped its antlers. And this happens somewhere between November to at latest mid-December is when their antlers drop, before the harshest part of the winter. And for our females, they'll keep their antlers well into the spring, dropping them in March or as late as early June. So almost at the beginning of the summer is when they're dropping their antlers. And the question is, why is this? Well, we have to think about the point when the antlers don't overlap, where the males drop them and the females still have them. This is the heart of the winter season when the snow is falling all over their grounds, their feeding grounds, and they're scrounging to get food. They're trying to dig through the dirt looking for any vegetation they can find. In fact, their main primary winter food source is this, which is called reindeer lichen, literally reindeer lichen. And it's the only plant that really gets them through the winter season, is eating all this lichen as much as they possibly can. And for a female that's been part of this harem of that a male had, she's bred with him, she's raising a youngster, she's pregnant, and she wants to get as much nutrition as possible so that her baby's as strong coming out as possible. And so while she's feeding, she has to dig through snow, and in some cases, inches or even feet of snow to get at this lichen or any dead grasses that she can find. And so each time she digs, it's incredibly energy intensive, and it's very important that she holds on to that little hole that she's been digging to get all that food out. If another big male with a big rack came along, or a big sturdy male pushed her along, or another female pushed her along, she would lose that food source and would be worse off over the course of the winter. So by keeping those antlers a little while longer, she's protecting herself while she feeds, and the bigger she has of a rack and the bigger she is, the more access to the good food she's going to have over the course of the wintertime. And so she'll keep those antlers well into the spring when she gives birth to her calf, and those antlers serve, again, a dual purpose. She can protect that calf from predators like wolves or other animals out on the landscape by using those antlers for a few weeks during that baby's first weeks of life. So what I want you to think about is, if you do the math, December 25th, we've got Santa flying around with his reindeer, and those reindeer are always depicted with antlers. Now remember, our male reindeer, our male caribou, lose their antlers in mid-December at the very latest, which means if Santa's reindeer have antlers, guess what? They're all female. So that's my last rule I'm going to break today. Thanks so much for this presentation, and I'm going to open it up for some questions.
Thank you, Mike. That was a very timely way to end. Thank you. We do have some good questions for you. I just want to remind everyone watching, if you have questions for Mike, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, so I'll stay on reindeer for now. Okay. Do the female reindeer use the antlers to dig out of the snow?
Ooh, so not typically. I'm sure you could probably find an example of the odd individual doing it, but it's not something specifically that they do. In fact, what's interesting about reindeer or caribou is that their hooves are quite wide, almost as big as a pie plate, and they've got very sharp edges along the leading edge of the hoof, and those hooves act like a shovel to dig through the snow. So they've got a specially designed feature already built in, and those are the hooves to dig through the snow.
All right. Okay, so moving on. Would you consider the armadillo's skin scales?
Ooh, that's a good question. So when we talk about scales, we talk about the keratin that grows from the skin, very similar to our fingernails. And when we talk about armadillos, they can have a little bit of scaling along some of the bands that allows for some flexibility. But actually, what covers their body is, if you look at a skeleton of an armadillo, it's really cool. They have, essentially, their body has these bone plates all along it, almost like a turtle shell. And then on top of the turtle shell bone is a layer of really, really tough skin. So depends a little bit on where you draw the line for the definition of a scale versus tough skin. But typically, when we look at the research, it's more considered skin than it is considered scales for an armadillo. Certainly, it's not a scale in the same way as a lizard or a snake.
Okay. So what is the theory for why the pangolin is found in so many places across the world?
Oh, good question. Well, this is a species that goes after something relatively small. They go after ants and termites, and all across the world we have ants and termites, right? Just about everywhere, almost every continent we do. And so an animal that utilizes that kind of resource is going to do quite well. And so if we go back billions of years, as these species are evolving and coming into their own, a lot of these continents are touching, specifically Asia and Africa. And so that's why we get a band of species that's somewhat similar between Asia and Africa, is because of those continents touching, and because they're going after a lot of the same insects that are found all over the world. They do quite well in those environments. Now, that being said, this is actually a species that is one of the biggest conservation issues we have today. There's a lot of poaching when it comes to pangolins, because of the fact that their scales are thought in some traditional Asian medicines as curing a number of different diseases, being helpful and useful to eat, and as well as their meat being considered a delicacy. And so the species is protected in all of its ranges, but it's being poached in those cases because of that scaly exterior that I've been talking about. So it's certainly something to educate yourself on, learn a little bit more about. World Wildlife Fund's doing a lot of work to try to help protect the pangolin, which is a really unique and interesting species that's under a great amount of threat right now.
Okay, moving on to another subject. Do shark eggs contain only one young per egg?
Oh, so that's typically the case. There are some odd examples I've seen of kind of double yolking like you see in a chicken egg, but most cases it's just one individual.
All right. And on a similar subject, if the skate egg is like leather, how does the baby get out?
Ah, good question. So this is kind of interesting. Keep in mind, again, the egg sits at the bottom of the ocean, the seafloor, for 4 to 10 months. Now, during that time, that young is growing up, but that egg is quite leathery, and after a little while, it kind of runs out of the water inside of the egg to be able to breathe. And so ordinary circumstances, it would actually start suffocating relatively early on. And so that eggshell will actually start splitting on its own, almost like a seed splitting over time. That eggshell will split and let in new fresh water, help flushing out some of the fluids and allow that youngster to continue developing. Now, during that same time, as that young is ready to hatch out, they can also utilize that slit that's kind of started to open up and then push themselves out through that slit just by peeling it open as they're swimming through.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a few questions about the polar bear grizzly hybrid. Someone wants to know, what's the diet? Do they tend to hunt like a polar bear would, or do they eat more like a grizzly? And
Right.
and in terms of behavior, do they tend to favor one more than the other?
Good question. So hybrids, when we talk about polar bears and grizzly bears, are quite rare. This isn't something that's happening a lot right now. We have just a handful of examples. There have been a lot of suspected examples. Occasionally we see this in the news. Hunters shot supposedly a grizzly or a growler bear or a pizzly bear. But when we send the genetics back, turns out it's just a really blonde grizzly bear. So the actual true hybrids are quite rare. In this paper from 2016 actually showed that one female up in the northern Arctic of Canada, that 10960, she mated with one male grizzly, had a set of kids, mated with a different male grizzly, had another set of kids, and then some of those sets of kids actually mated with their father, unbeknownst to them, because it was the grizzly bear in the area, and had their own set of kids. And so that whole lineage of hybrids that we mostly know about is actually just from one female polar bear that really like grizzly bears for whatever reason. So when it comes to understanding their ecology, what they eat, where they live, how they act, we don't really know a lot. Studying these animals out in the Arctic, it's hard enough to typically finding the polar bear, unless you're places like Churchill, to actually then study not only a rare example of a polar bear, but an even rarer example of a hybrid. We don't know a lot about their ecology. There was a thought initially that, well, if the polar bear has these issues with climate change and it's losing the sea ice, if it breeds with these grizzlies and becomes like an intermediate version, maybe it's going to be the best of both worlds, and that can go on the sea ice if it wants to, and it can live on land if it wants to, and it may be kind of the future of the polar bear as we know it. But the unfortunate thing is it's because that polar bear unlike the grizzly bear, which is very much a generalized animal, can eat a lot of different animals in a lot of different environments, the polar bear is incredibly specialized. Its body is completely adapted to live on sea ice and go after seals. That long neck of the polar bear fits down into a hole of a seal that comes up for air. It's got very short but nice sharp curved claws to grab at the ice. It's got specially designed features on its pads that allow it to walk on slippery ice. And its completely white coat allows them to blend in very well in its snowy environment. Now, if we take a polar bear and mix it like we saw in the picture, what we get is an intermediate. So if that growler bear were to go out hunting seals, his head is a little bit wider than it needs to be to fit inside the ice hole. Its claws aren't as useful out on the ice, and its coloration is a little bit darker than it needs to be out on the snow to hide from seals that are looking around from the water's edge. So it doesn't actually do that well in those kinds of environments from what we can guess. It may do okay in a more grizzly-like environment, but again, it's not as good as a grizzly. So it's going to be kind of, by having characteristics of both worlds, it doesn't really fit into either one. So certainly if we see more of these hybrids, we'll start to learn a little bit more about how well they do. But as of right now, the only way we're finding them is typically from native hunters going after and finding these individuals, and then the DNA getting brought back to a park or resources office, and then that's getting sent to some scientists. So certainly the research is still out as to what's going to happen with these hybrids, but as of right now, we don't think it's necessarily going to be a boon for polar bears anytime soon.
All right. Okay, one last question. We had a couple of people wondering about the barreleye and how deep does it live? And if it were in an aquarium, would it need a special pressurized tank?
Yeah, so the barreleye can go incredibly deep. We're talking 600, 800 meters, 2,500 feet, 2,600 feet down our water's depths. This is in places like the Pacific Ocean where we can find this guy. And the reason we don't know a lot about this species is not because we haven't seen a number of individuals. We have, but when we bring them up from such incredible depths in a net, bring them up to the surface, that beautiful clear dome of the head deflates because of the pressure changes as it's going up the water column. Same problem if a scuba diver tries to go up too fast from the bottom of the seafloor up to the surface, they could have some serious issues. And the same thing happens to these fish that get caught in nets. And so what we know of the species is by looking at their body that's been kind of wrecked by pressure. The only real footage of this animal living in an environment is from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute at depth. Though they were able to bring one particular individual up, try to keep the pressure a slow, gradual change over time, put it in a specialized aquarium that has a bit more pressure to it than a normal just tank on a table. And they were able to keep the animal alive for a few hours, but certainly not long enough to know a lot about its biology. But that tank experiment was the entire reason we know that those big eyes, which look like they shouldn't move, can actually swivel forward. It's the whole reason we know that is from that experiment. So hopefully through more research at depth and maybe through some differences in technology with pressurized tanks, we can start to learn a little bit more, but don't look for one in an aquarium anytime soon.
Okay, great. Well, it's the top of the hour, Mike. This was so fun. I just love these rule breakers presentations. Thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Great, thanks, Kendall. Well, again, thanks everyone for joining me for this presentation. I had a blast. I hope you did as well, learning a little bit about the weird wildlife that we have out in the world. I want to wish everyone a happy holidays and hopefully see you next time in the new year.
All right, well, thanks again, Mike, and Mike, thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. It's our last webinar of the week, so be sure to join us next week on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out our new lineup on our website and in our Sunday e-news. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Happy holidays.